Today we will be listening to Professor William Beasley, who is a professor of history at the University of Arizona. He's the director of the Oaxaca Graduate Field School in Modern Mexican History. He has edited many important books on the history of Mexico, so it's a great pleasure to have you here today. Please help me in welcoming Professor Beasley.
Thank you for the invitation, thank you for the introduction, and thank all of you for being here this afternoon, this late in the term. This is a new project for me, and I started out with the idea that I would write a biography of Vasconcelos because I thought he was such a seminal figure in the Mexican Cultural Revolution. You'll see very shortly that I don't want to write a biography of Vasconcelos because he turns out to be a really unlikable person. And I don't want to spend a lot of time with him, at least the way he was after 1929. Because this is a new work, unfortunately I'll have to read more than I would normally. I apologize for that, but I want to make the points. My plan is to speak for about, or read for about 40 minutes, and I hope that's within the guidelines that you expected, about 40 minutes, and I don't have a watch. I have to look at my phone to see what time it is, and I'll stop at about 40 minutes so we can talk. I'm interested in your reactions, your questions, and what you think is going on. At that point, I also have some kind of grander ideas about where this particular talk fits into not only Mexico but Latin American history, and I hope that that will come as a kind of surprise. That's my goal, is to surprise you at a couple of points. That's because my view of history really is that you should, as a famous novelist once said, history should prepare you to be surprised and then to be surprised again. And so that's what I want to do, is create a series of surprises for you. Mexican revolutionaries set out to create a new culture and a more inclusive society at the beginnings of the 1920s. Less heralded than land reform and worker organization, the cultural campaign still received general fanfare and widespread acceptance, largely through the educational initiatives inaugurated by José Vasconcelos, the secretary of the newly recreated Ministry of Public Education. It was recreated in 1921. The secretary had a deep-seated commitment to education. His proposal for the new ministry was inspired by Anatoly Lunarchevsky, the first Soviet commissar for enlightenment in charge of cultural and education. If I aspired to anything beyond professor of history, I think I might go for commissar for enlightenment. It has a kind of ring to it that you could use, you know, in certain circles, or at least over cocktails. Yes, commissar of enlightenment. That's who I am. The Vasconcelos program aimed at incorporating the people, including the indigenous communities, into unified, literate, Spanish-speaking Mexicans with a modern, secular, standardized education based on Western civilization at large and Hispanic culture in particular. That is, he envisioned a nation that shared both a mixed ethnic biology and Hispanic culture. A mixed ethnic biology and Hispanic culture. This is just to show you there were some major battles of the revolution. They're not often talked about, but that's where they were. And this is the guy we're talking about, José Vasconcelos. The program that Vasconcelos envisioned called for a three-part administration of schools, libraries, and fine arts. The latter division, fine arts, had responsibility for instruction of singing, drawing, and physical fitness in all schools, and for the supervision of existing institutions such as the Academy of Fine Arts, the National Museum, and the conservatories. There were two, the conservatories of music. Vasconcelos identified what he considered two exigent conditions in 1921: the Indian inability to speak Spanish and the widespread population unable to read, and for both, he created provisional teaching departments to confront these issues. For reaching the Indian populations, he drew on the model of the Spanish missionaries.
Matt, you replace the microphone, it's on his coat.
Oh, I'll keep it on then. Now I'll keep my coat on then. I was just thinking, wow, this is being televised, so edit it, cut, all those kind of things. So, for reaching the Indian populations, he drew on the model of the Spanish missionaries to create teacher missions that he called missionaries of indigenous culture and public education. These included a basic instructor and at times others who were expert in agriculture, arts, and crafts. He envisioned, among his more elaborate plans, what he called village public readers and musicians. The first, the public readers, would read aloud in village squares history, geography, and newspapers. I know nothing about these people. I'd love to know their reactions, their discussions of people's reaction to hearing history, geography, and newspapers being read to them in the plazas. And the second, the musician, would play tunes that were supposed to awaken local interest in traditional melodies. And again, as far as I know, no one has really examined who these musicians were and what their experiences were in remote Mexico. I'm sure they must have been incredible. Vasconcelos has remained highly praised for these campaigns as the Minister of Public Education. In particular, his educational missions have been highly noted, highly merited, because they created opportunities for women. And some people argue that these educational missions created more opportunities for women than any other change in the 1920s. Certainly that's true in rural Mexico. It's debatable for the cities where, with the rise of the telephone company, the opportunities to be telephone operators also was equally as important, and it appears that young women had the choice of going to the countryside away from their family to have that independence, or to stay in the city and be telephone operators and live at home to have that kind of community support, that kind of family support. So it's an interesting division of women's opportunities. So that's one reason they've been praised. Secondly, his educational campaigns in the cities have been widely noted because of the muralist movement, that is the painting on public walls by Diego Rivera, David Sequeiros, and Jose Clemente Orozco. Everyone, I think, is familiar with this group of grand masters of the mural art. This evaluation stands even though, beginning with the 1929 presidential campaign fiasco, Vasconcelos became increasingly controversial because of his racial and later racist views, his increasing fascist politics, and his misogynist social attitudes. Here you can see why I no longer have an interest in writing a biography of this person. The latter, that is his misogynist social attitudes, was dismissed by one author who liked Vasconcelos a lot, These were dismissed euphemistically by saying he chafed under the restrictions of family life. This sounds like a divorce lawyer trying to cover up a good deal of activity. As for his racist views embedded in the discussions of the mestizo and the cosmic race, by the early 1930s, Vasconcelos wanted his nation to get in step with what he considered the direction to the future represented by Adolf Hitler and German Nazism. Okay, now you know why I've decided there's no way I'm writing a biography of this guy. Historians and other scholars over the past 2 decades have reached a number of new conclusions and revised interpretations about the Cultural Revolution, Obregon's administration, social programs, indigenous peoples, and official mestizaje as a redemption of the nation. All of these new studies intimate the need for a reassessment of Vasconcelos as Minister of Education and his programs of education, art, and music. Alan Knight's book on the article on the Cultural Revolution is a good place to begin if you're interested. What becomes immediately apparent is that several essential persons in the ministry have been ignored, pushed to the background, where they stand in Vasconcelos' shadow. Moreover, other successful ministers, without Vasconcelos' gift for self-promotion, have been overlooked, despite the significance of their achievements. Perhaps the best example here is El Dr. Gabriel M. Malda, head of the Department of Public Health, who directed an incredibly successful campaign against infectious diseases during the 1920s that dramatically improved health conditions throughout the nation. And yet we know nothing about Malda and too much about Vasconcelos. Vasconcelos became duly famous for his promotion of the cosmic race, personified as the Mexican mestizo who represented the biological merging of the Spanish and indigenous peoples with the admixture, at least the admixture, of the cultures of African and Asian individuals as well. The mestizos, in his judgment, would form the new nation with a culture that was unmistakably Hispanic. In order to achieve this, he intended to establish a mass culture through mass distribution of both canonical, literary, and musical works, and everything that could be claimed as national and Hispanic. He talks about the cosmic race, he talks about this blending of cultures, but ultimately it was a culture that was going to be based on Hispanic cultural developments and the canon developed in Spain. Even when his rural programs were described with a gentle sarcasm, he still pushed forward. And what I mean by gentle sarcasm is that President Obregón often made fun of him because Vasconcelos had the plan to redeem rural Mexico in part by distributing translated copies of Plato and Homer. He once said he expected to distribute 100,000 copies of the Iliad throughout the countryside. The success of that program is that in many rural markets in Mexico today, you can obtain cheap copies of the Iliad in Spanish that were distributed by the Ministry of Public Education in case you are there and you want something to read. This cosmic race meant the mestizos would become the new revolutionary Mexico, and they would spring from the regenerated indigenous peoples. Vasconcelos summed up his view by saying, Indianism means going back millennia. In other words, Vasconcelos envisioned a uniform mestizo population and opposed the goal of preserving indigenous cultural diversity that was promoted at the time by several anthropologists. The general revolutionary program of indigenismo, the concern for the indigenous people, resulted in the hands of Vasconcelos in several programs for Indian assimilation, especially as he designed it through education in the countryside. His goal was to redefine living Indians, this is a quote from Vasconcelos, to redefine living Indians from a national embarrassment into an integral component of the new revolutionary nation. He developed a plan for what he considered social regeneration for rural, especially indigenous peoples, through cultural programs that included traditional and folkloric demonstrations with related popular arts, music, dances, and handicrafts, all to rediscover the grandeur of the pre-Hispanic indigenous past. Vasconcelos, in developing his program, drew on his intellectual associates, who included Antonio Caso, Geraldo Murillo, that is Dr. Alt, Adolfo Bess Magard, and Roberto Montenegro, many of whom came from the Ateneo, of which he had been a member, and also a younger generation, a circle around Bess Magard. Here, I think it's interesting that the Atenistas, the members of the Ateneo, focused on the written word, both essays and literature, to put forward their views, while their younger colleagues around Bess Magard turned to painting and, in several cases, film, including both feature-length cinema and ethnographic documentaries. The early history of Mexican silent film and of the development of documentaries include the circle of people around Bess Magard who were working in the Ministry of Public Education. Together, they attempted to give value to the indigenous past by promoting events that would illustrate the indigenous base of national identity. Created by these individuals, by these intellectuals, as Rick Lopez has shown, they singled out indigenous art and music as the base for a national aesthetic. For example, professional dancers, notably Anne Sokolov, gave folkloric ballets such as Fantasia Mexicana, and composers Manuel Ponce and Carlos Chavez wrote classical music inspired by popular examples. Exhibitions of typical handicrafts were celebrated as expressions of the authentic national heritage, but neither Vasconcelos nor the intellectuals, such as Francisco Zamora, saw much in these things beyond an inspiration for what would become academically trained musicians, artists, and even people trained to do handicrafts. The Vasconcelos campaign, especially these cultural programs for national integration, was a step ahead, but only a step of similar campaigns in other Hispanic nations with large, unassimilated indigenous or immigrant populations. During the 1920s and the 1930s, this resulted in programs that used the ideology of mestizaje, often mixed with anti-materialism, pan-Latin American thought, spearheaded by people like José Martí, José Rodó, and José Vasconcelos, to promote the ideas of a unique culture in Peru, Brazil, Argentina, or other places. This development, focused on mestizaje, rejected European theories of racial degeneration and positivism, and U.S. economic and political involvement in Latin America. Moreover, mestizaje managed most of the time to balance the competing views of Hispanismo and indigenismo as the main source of national character. These inclusive definitions of national identity and assimilation programs, especially promoting education and folklore, were often described as populist movements in the 1920s and the 1930s. And I can come back and would like to come back and talk about this a little bit, I think developed a a definition of national identity used throughout Latin America from the 1920s that remained in place until the 1980s with the rise of ethnic politics in various countries in Latin America. So we're talking about developments that shaped 60 years of Latin American politics and cultural history and the way national identity was defined. The hemispheric programs in mass education help promote widespread admiration for Secretary Vasconcelos' policies, especially his rural education program. Certainly, Vasconcelos inspired this program, but its conception and its execution as an everyday practice were two different things. And it seems more and more apparent to me that the person who put the plan into operation was Rafael Ramirez. Rafael Ramirez, at the level of theory, Vasconcelos certainly drew on the legacy of individuals who believed it was both possible and necessary to assimilate indigenous people. But on the level of practice, it was Ramirez who figured out how to do that and sent the instructions to teachers about what they should do. Ramirez is a very interesting guy, and there's not really a biography of him in English or in Spanish. There's a collection of some of his speeches with a biographical introduction. He's an extremely interesting person. And he's the one who, if there was a success in Mexico's cultural educational program, who was responsible for it, I think. Rafael Ramirez remained in his position under several revolutionary presidents and several ministers of education. This is another reason why he's worthy of a great deal more attention than he's received in the past. Of particular concern to Ramirez was the prospect that teachers might slip into using the local language rather than Spanish, and ultimately, like occasional foreign travelers and zealous cultural anthropologists, the teachers might go native, so to speak. And so there's constant concern on Ramirez to examine that. Teachers at times face community or family opposition to the schools that removed children from the workforce, taught them behavior contrary to community legacies, and encouraged ambitions that some parents thought were beyond the children. So Ramirez's success had a checkered character, depending on both families and communities. Ramirez, with various titles, including Director of Rural Education, supervised the daily activities of teachers, as I've said, and eventually spent time in the United States in several graduate programs of education, and eventually was recognized by UNESCO for his programs, and his program was defined as one that underdeveloped, as the language of the period would say, that underdeveloped nations who wanted to follow an educational program should adopt the programs developed by Ramirez. Now, opposed to this, the major support for indigenous people came from anthropologists, particularly Manuel Gamio. You can see he's an anthropologist by looking at his eyes, right? Manuel Gamio, the father of Mexican anthropology, and Moises Sainz, who at the same time were often at odds with each other. Oh, nope, I thought I had one of him as well. They were often at odds with each other and with the Vasconcelos program. They looked at rural projects not for social regeneration, but as campaigns to reinvigorate indigenous communities. The inspiration of these anthropologists was the Columbia University professor Franz Boas. Boas, in fact, had served as the first director of Mexico's Escuela Internacional de Antropología, founded in 1910. Boas had developed theories of cultural relativism that rejected the theories of racial evolution that were being put forward by anthropologists at the University of Chicago, particularly Frederick Starr at the time. So this is like a major turning point in the history of anthropology. And it inspired the anthropologists in Mexico who had the opportunity to practice applied anthropology. The indigenistas, as these anthropologists were often called, wanted to inspire and preserve indigenous cultures, but they also wanted to document and preserve the cultures as they existed. They eventually fell into arguments among themselves that disrupted their efforts, but still they managed to carry out some pilot projects. And Gamio in particular carried out a project in the Teotihuacan Valley to see if his ideas would work with a community. Other anthropologists endorsed the idea and attempted to follow his efforts. And so there are a series of communities in which anthropologists are responsible for trying to create regenerative, reinvigorated indigenous communities. These were sponsored at times by the John Gettings Gray Memorial Fund at Tulane. And again, this is a huge topic that has yet to be explored. And the materials at Tulane, as far as I know, have not been exploited by scholars to any extent. So there's material. If you're a graduate student and you want to spend your research time going back and forth between Mexico and New Orleans, yeah, all right. There's an opportunity for you, because we don't know what was going on in these communities. But we know they began during the 1920s, and these model indigenous communities continued into the 1930s under Lázaro Cárdenas. So there's some excellent opportunities for research there, about which I'm extremely interested. Now, in addition to that, the anthropologists illustrated what I think is a fundamental and unique characteristic of the Mexican Revolution. That is their openness to what was going on in the outside world. And the anthropologists that I've just been talking about wanted to see how other Latin American countries were trying to deal with assimilation. So people like Gamio traveled widely to Guatemala, Ecuador, Bolivia, Peru, and Brazil, and Argentina to collect information on assimilation programs and to see how they could shape their policies based on what was going on in other places, to pull out of these programs what was good. I think this is unique in revolutionary circles. Imagine the Soviets in the 20s, maybe seeking technological information, but not this kind of information, or the Chinese after 48, or Castro. Now, it didn't happen, and yet the Mexicans not only were doing it here, but they invited a whole series of other interesting people to advise them on programs they were trying to carry out. I'll mention just one other. Jane Addams was invited to come from Chicago and Hull House to come down and talk about issues of urbanization and maintaining family unity that was her basic concern in Chicago. Really exciting and interesting aspect of the Mexican Revolution. Well, these efforts inspired Ramirez as well. And Ramirez got the idea of changing the educational missions. And he decided that instead of having a musician sitting in the square playing tunes, that they should send out experts, one of whom would be a musician, to teach music in rural Mexico. Investigators have generally ignored this aspect of the rural education program. It began in 1922, and music teachers would go out for 6 weeks or 8 weeks different communities to teach people songs and music, and to organize a kids chorus and an adult chorus that would learn basic songs. What fascinates me about this is what songs the teachers said they taught. And of course, all of the teachers said they taught the national anthem so that everybody could sing at least the first verse of the Mexican national anthem, which, as we know from our own national anthem, is quite enough. After that it kind of gets murky, and and the same is true of the Mexican national anthem. Much more interesting is what they taught next. And this, to me, is fascinating, because a number of the teachers said what they taught the choruses to sing was La Cucaracha. Now, we all have a view of what La Cucaracha is about. The most important thing, I think, about La Cucaracha is that it was the Villa marching song. I've often wondered how across Mexico Villa and Zapata became folk heroes across the nation when they lost. And of course, Zapata, it's easy. As a promoter of land reform and emphasis on land reform, he had a great rural following. But what about Villa? Well, people were singing his songs beginning in 1922. Every time they sang La Cucaracha, it was not about the revolution, it was about Villa and Villa's revolution. I think it's fantastic to know that's what children and adults were learning to sing. Partly, goes into this as well, partly the effort to teach these songs to Mexicans in the rural countryside was to confront what I plan to call, when I write this up, the great foxtrot crisis in Mexico. Because Vasconcelos and Ramirez were deeply concerned that with the radio, Mexico was being inundated by the foxtrot. And even though some Mexican composers had taken the music and written Mexican versions, had appropriated the foxtrot and created Mexican foxtrots, still there it was. This is something to think about. I don't know about all of you, but I had my own crisis with the foxtrot. At about 13, it was not hearing it, but what to do when I did hear it, and where my feet ought to go. And so I'm wondering if this was part of the foxtrot crisis, was dancing in couples to this music. Vasconcelos tried to confront the foxtrot crisis by pushing for a collection of Mexican folk songs. He was very interested in preserving Mexican folk songs. And so he turned to an ethnomusicologist, perhaps Mexico's first ethnomusicologist, Joaquin Beristain, who was to go into Mexico Profundo, into the deepest, most remote parts of Mexico, and collect folk music and bring it back as an expression of the popular soul. But he didn't, Vasconcelos that is, didn't plan to have this music just circulate as it was. He wanted this music to be used by composers to integrate into a more popular music that could challenge the foxtrot. And here he called on the services of Manuel M. Ponce. And Ponce, a well-known composer at the time, Ponce was a specialist in canción mexicana, that is Mexican art songs, and so his art songs of the time incorporated themes that Beristain had collected from rural Mexico. And Vasconcelos saw these as the opportunity to create a higher, in his idea, a higher appreciation of music by hearing Mexican art songs. And you can kind of draw a line from Ponce on to Carlos Chavez in the 30s, who is best known for as the revolutionary composer. One musical historian, I have to read you this quote, one musical historian said that overall Vasconcelos' idea with this music was the creation of collective Neoplatonist flights of the national soul. Let me repeat that. Collective Neoplatonist flights of the national soul. I have no idea what this is supposed to mean, but I really love the idea that somebody wrote that down and thought that it did, right? The Vasconcelos Project for Music, whether devised by the minister or Beristain, accepted the importance of the canción as Manuel Ponce wrote it. And so part of my research now has been to listen to Ponce's compositions, and I spend a lot of time listening to him, trying to understand what's going on in the music. Let me tell you what an undertaking that is. As a failed tuba player, the idea of listening to music on a regular basis to see what's going on is incredible. It's like going to the dentist every morning. But I'm doing it. I'm going to understand this. So this was one of Vasconcelos' most successful programs in my estimation, the preservation of music and its appropriation and incorporation in a true sense of hybridity into Mexican music. Secondly, Vasconcelos, because he believed the indigenous communities were going to disappear, Vasconcelos also decided to hire a group of photographers to go into rural Mexico, into the backcountry, and photograph all of the indigenous cultures in their wide-ranging and musical and colorful diversity. I didn't want to show you a picture of Ponce. Sorry, I forgot to click this thing. Here's one of his, this is from the Smithsonian. You can order this off the internet if you want to get Ponce, an example of Ponce's music. And it's got a nice cover. It's an LP for those. If you don't know what an LP is, ask me at the end. It sort of predates 8 tracks. And this is another person I'm going to talk about in a minute, another musician. Now, he also wanted to hire photographers, and these photographers were sent out, there were a group of them, sent out to record what rural Mexico was like. And there are in fact thousands, I mean thousands, of photographs of rural Mexico from the 20s and 30s, especially photographs of women and their daily practices. The photographers who were hired became part of the Vasconcelos intellectual and artistic circle, and they included the foreigners Hugo Breme. Hugo Breme is a famous German photographer of the period. Francis Tour from the United States, famous folklorist eventually, and Manuel Toussaint, who was also involved in activities at the MoMA and other major galleries in the United States. All 3 of these guys also produced postcards that were important expressions of what was going on in Mexico, and of course contributed Barry to the desire to go be a tourist in Mexico because of the importance of these postcards. The most popular photographs were those done by an individual called Luis Marquez. Luis Marquez. Marquez had grown up in the artistic bohemian world of actors, artists, and intellectuals who were concerned about issues of identity in Mexico City. He grew up there because his father, Jose, was a major director of plays, and his father Jose also directed this sensational zarzuela, Chen Chun Chan, Mexico's most popular zarzuela, that's been performed over 2,000 times and is still being performed on a regular basis. I recommend it to you. It's a hilarious musical comedy. During the worst of the revolutionary fighting, Jose took the Marquez family, dropped them off in Havana, and he took the performers and toured Latin America until the worst of the fighting was over. During his time in Havana, Luis took up photography and very quickly became a successful photographer in Havana first. And in 1921, he returned to Mexico and was hired by the Ministry of Public Education to go into the countryside and photograph rural Mexico. He was a member of a group of photographers that were posted inside Bellas Artes, in the Department of Bellas Artes, under the administration of the Ministry of Education. The first indication that Marquez was going to do more than a bureaucratic job came when he was sent with Padre Canudo Flores, ethnographer Miguel Oton de Mendizábal, and the musicologist Francisco Dominguez to document the fiesta at Chalma. This was in 1922, and it's really hard to say, but I think this is the first documentary, certainly the first ethnographic documentary done in Mexico. And looking at Chalma. The result is especially interesting because when he was there, Marquez not only took photographs, but got very interested in the traje, in the costumes of different indigenous groups who were coming to Chalma, who were participating in the pilgrimage. He ended up buying a complete set, a complete traje, a complete woman's costume, and this set him off on what became one of his obsessions, the collection of rural indigenous traje. In the end, his collection reached 2,800 costumes, all of them meticulously documented, and all of them today available to researchers at the Colegio de Ex Convento de... No, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz. Yeah. Marquez's plan was to create a museum of indigenous traje. And the museum hasn't really developed, but you can see them at this colegio. Meanwhile, Marquez worked in and around the movie industry, primarily as a still photographer. His photographs number over 200,000 of pre-Hispanic, colonial, and modern architecture, landscapes, and indigenous customs. Most of these form part of an archive at the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas at UNAM, where they're easily available. His photographs captured contemporary indigenous life and vestiges of the pre-Columbian past. And this is exactly what Vasconcelos hoped that they would do. Now, it's interesting that there's an unusual connection between the official Vasconcelos program and the national cultures of Mexican daily life. Not for the first time, small businessmen, the petit bourgeois, found an economic opportunity that served in the creation of ideas about national identity. This is like a self-serving promotional statement, because that's the argument I make about Mexican identity puppets in the 19th century. Book called Mexican National Identity, which I must tell you is an incredible Hanukkah or Christmas present. It's available from Barnes & Noble. Okay. The people I'm talking about were a group of printers who saw a commercial opportunity. The first of these was a man named Salvador Garcia Guerrero and his partner, Francisco Gonzalez de la Vega, many of you have any reason to remember. They founded something called Enseñanza Objetiva. And by 1935, this had become the first printing house to produce calendars in Mexico. Calendars as an advertising medium. Their printing competitors like Galas de Mexico, still in operation today in Querétaro, quickly followed. Once these companies undertook the production of calendars, they hired painters to produce the calendar images. And beginning in the 1930s, they began the idea that they would paint images of folkloric figures, especially indigenous women, charro horsemen, revolutionaries, and landscapes, and of course the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Jarabe Tapatio, and the volcanoes that dominate the Mexican countryside. These paintings were then photographed and reproduced through chromolithography for annual calendars. Here's why this was so incredible. Large enterprises like Jose Cuervo, the tequila manufacturer, would order as many as 200,000 calendars a year to give away free. And of course, a large number of other major manufacturers used this opportunity to distribute advertising by distributing calendars. Now, the artists who were hired to paint these images were urban artists who, for the most part, had no idea what indigenous women looked like. Except, you know, they thought they'd know one if they met one, but not much beyond that. Consequently, these artists looked around to find expressions of what these indigenous women look like. They turned to Luis Marquez and rented his photographs of indigenous women. And not only that, because they wanted to be precise in what the women's costumes looked like and what the folkloric images looked like, they also rented the costumes that Luis Marquez had collected, painted them, and they show up on the calendar. Many of you probably have seen these calendars, may even have them at home, probably have made disparaging remarks as you had a tequila about them, but they're real. The basis of these things come from photographs. It's dazzling. And consequently, let's see if we can move to. So here's Marquez telling me to move it along here. Okay, here's his photograph. And here is the calendar. And the only thing that's different is he got rid of the kind of cut paper hat the artist did. Sorry. Well, I can't get out of the way. I'm trying. Okay, here, this is another painted calendar. Spectacular. This is based on a photograph. Another photograph. Mariachis, of course, based on photographs. And my favorite, this one, is the, and the reason I wanted to put this up there is I did not discover this by doing my own research, but a woman in Los Angeles, Angela Villalba, has a book called Mexican Calendar Girls. This is what the cover is. I recommend it to you. And because she's done research on these calendar girls and it fit with what I was doing. It's unbelievable. She does wonderful stuff. and I recommend the book to you. Let me skip way ahead here and tell you that I want to stop so we have time to have some questions. At the same time that the Calendar Girls were being promoted as an expression of Mexican culture, music on the radio in response to the foxtrot was really settled in many ways by the Mexican presidents. And we talk about the Mexican presidents as the Norteños coming down from Sonora, and then Cardenas, who's from the west. Well, that northern western corridor, in musical terms, leaned more toward mariachis, and these presidents encouraged mariachis to come to Mexico City so they could listen to them. Remember, we're talking about young guys, the revolutionists, who loved music and drinking and good times. They'd been in the revolution, and when they became president, they didn't change. The world's most famous mariachi group, Mariachi Vargas, right, that claims to be the most famous mariachi group in the world, were encouraged to come to Mexico City by Obregón. And they almost went broke. To save them, this was several years later, to save them, President Cardenas called the chief of police of Mexico City and said, hire Mariachi Vargas as the official police band. Which he did, and that saved them, and they went on to become great mariachi players. Okay, how ironic that the long enduring and most common evidence of the Ministry of Public Education under Vasconcelos' direction could be seen in romantic images of the nation and its people on the common calendar and on the radio in mariachi music that came to symbolize the nation. In a simple twist of fate, Vasconcelos' cosmic race found its widely known and accepted expression in the calendar. Yes.
Thanks a lot for your talk. Turning over to the very last sentence, you were saying that, I mean, I can see the connection between the photographs that were commissioned and eventually found their way through this kind of postcard. And you can notice that actually, I would just point out again that when you showed before the original photo and then the calendar itself, as typical of all of them, you notice that the person is taller, wider, and has more European features. And that's one of the things that you notice in all those calendars, is that everyone, it's not just that their life appeal, sexually appealing, it's also that it's a kind of an appeal. More European.
I agree with you, and so it's an exact expression of the way Vasconcelos saw the cosmic race and what he thought the mestizo was going to be. This was a mestizo here. This was really a mestizo because it's a person of cultural hybridity who looks European, who looks Spanish.
But I don't see that connection for the music, because what he was trying to do was, when you were referring to hybridity, the kind of hybridity he was looking for was more of an elite nature. So that's why he had the conservatory trained Ponce, who was supposed to then come up with these ideas. He was basically, specializing in waltzes. Something that might be helpful to look at is that same kind of conception going on in the 20s in the United States. So you had people like Charles Seeger and Copeland getting together and actually thinking that they were going to write worker anthems. By the way, none of them were successful, but they did throw these things out. Well, what really is successful hybridity that took place was, like you were saying, the mariachi came down, but at first it was a little bit happenstance, but after that, it was very deliberate policy that, look, Mexico is too much of a footwork. We need to pick one musical form and one folk dance, and that's going to be the Mexican folk dance. And that was very heavily promoted and others excluded. And that's why even today, no matter where people are from, when they immigrate somewhere, they say, well, if we're gonna do a Mexican dance, we gotta do the jarabe tapatío, because that's supposed to be the national dance. And what Ponce came up with his hybrid, it's actually failed. And they used to distribute these radios, on the countryside, as you know, and they would put them only to the frequency. They only had one frequency on the radio. And it would only go to the Ministry of Culture. And the idea was that therefore they would listen to this more elevated, more elite hybridity and raise the rates, or we could better say, as you're well pointing out, channel in particular Hispanic direction. And they always kept breaking these. People kept trying to find the other channels, but what they wanted was the canción rancheras that were coming around all over the place. And that was a popular based hybridity. So really, Vasconcelos, there was a hybridity, but it didn't really come through the way, the channel that he was hoping it came through different.
Well, I agree with you, but I would add to it. I think what's happening with what happened with the mariachi groups who came to Mexico City, that once they got there, there was a kind of response to what the presidents and the audience expected. And so they adjusted and became less rural, less country, added trumpets, did the kinds of things that made it fit not only radio, but also fit the expectations of an urban audience. Either there, or of course they were also going to Tijuana, the series of resorts that were being developed there, so they also had to respond to an American audience. But
And through film, all Latin.
of course. And so this leads to what my new discovery is for research, is that a lot of Mexicans couldn't afford, in the 30s particularly and on, couldn't afford either record players, phonographs, or records, but they could afford to put pesos in jukeboxes. So I'm moving into jukebox history in a big way, and it's fascinating. I'm on the track of Wurlitzer Archives and Seabird, but it's fascinating because I do have some information on the number of jukeboxes exported to Mexico and how well they were doing. And I want to know what was being placed on there. Those are the cultural arbiters that I'm interested in discovering as I go forward with this study.
One of your best sources will be right down here, Chris Scarpets.
Yes, of course.
Oh, well, a music note, because I have a very dear friend.
Was that like a pun? Music note? Which one?
Well, you pick it.
Okay.
A major one.
Oh, okay.
Not mine. It is a minor. I have a very dear friend who grew up in Sonora. I forgot the name of the little town. But he tells me in the elementary school about the first thing that they sang was the Internacional.
Mm.
I found this out because there was a box that plays it, and he was intrigued by this.
Wow.
Second point, somewhat more major, I'm an authority on the dress of the China Poblana, and I've done research in the Marqués collection. So it's very interesting because he altered some of the dress so that it could be used in dance, and it was true.
No, I don't doubt it. That's
Yeah.
really why I came, was so that people who have information would be willing to share it. So I need to get your email so we can talk. And the big question is, did you get to use the Marquez papers?
Yes. And, well, I was there at the convention Solawana, and I forgot, I don't think they have the same head of that museum that they did. I did this in, mainly through the 90s at different times, and partly I'm also very knowledgeable about the Mexican rebozo, and, who's wearing it what.
Where's the best one come from?
Oh, that's very difficult. Very good collection of the Bronx Mayor, but,
I know that there are those people who say, of course, that it comes from Santa Maria del Rio outside of San
oh,
Luis
that's the
Potosí.
silk.
Yeah,
And
the
that
silk
was
one.
a school that was started by the Museo de Arte Popular. And there's some extremely fine ones from, in cotton from Tenancingo. But, long story.
Well, as we say, that's music to my ears. Yes, dear.
Yeah, very interesting presentation, Bill. Just a couple of points here.
Aha!
One place where
Yes.
you could consume mariachi and other music cheaply, of course, was in public spaces. And so
Right.
I'm interested in the evolution of now of La Plaza Garibaldi, which we always associated with mariachi music and which begins to develop in the mid-1920s. And so in the sense that, although it's expensive to actually obviously rent a mariachi band, you could go for free there. And it is very interesting, as you rightly point out, that the interest of the state, both federal and state government, in appropriating mariachi music actually goes back to the late Porfiriato. In fact, according to some of the most recent research, and there's a wonderful anthropological text, it's one of those coffee table books that I'm sure you've seen, you may have it. It's a book that came out about 6 or 7 years ago about the history of mariachi music, a very serious investigation, which shows definitively that it's not from Jalisco, as we know, as the people from Tapatíos argue, and in fact comes a little bit further north in sort of Nayarit and Sinaloa. So, I mean, this is one more piece of evidence, I mean, along with the jukebox, of how, it shows, I think, how little we know, really, about the popular appropriation and use, of what the public actually saw and understood and did, as opposed to simply collecting the artifacts themselves, largely through elite sources. On the issue of the kind of the evacuation of indigenous features, I mean, you see that also happening, and there's been, as you know, there's been some interesting writing about the India Bonita competition of the early 1920s. It was all the research on that shows, not just Rick Lopez, but many others who worked on it, that newspapers, of course, which are interested in advertising, and advertising is obviously a key part of your whole story, which involves the United States, I mean, as a model for how you deal with advertising. All that the advertisers were, of course, interested primarily in European sort of looking faces, although, as you right, I think say, you know, Vasconcelos himself, really his vision of the mestizo was a kind of Europeanized mestizo. So, I mean, those are just the kind of comments I wanted to make here.
Well, quick response is that one of the fascinating things about jukebox studies is that we would be looking at the community conflicts that develop, because once a bar owner puts in a jukebox, then it does damage the income of local musicians who traditionally come in and play for tips and that sort of thing. So that's something I want to look at, is the conflicts that follow that.
And be at breweries, I think that you should be keeping your eye very firmly on breweries, who were the other great advertisers,
Right.
mining advertisers, and they were also very interested in notions of sanitization of Mexico, get rid of that nasty, filthy pulque, and have something which was regenerative. I mean, beer was part of that notion of regeneration of the notion. So I think beer and jukeboxes probably go together.
Yeah, the serving trays.
So
That's in my life.
How much internal debate was there, say during the 1920s, between this kind of cultural ossification that you get in the sentimentalizations of the native people, and a different impulse, which might be called modernity or refusal to participate in reinventing, and we know that anthropologists and artists were constantly inventing a past that they commodified. So I'm wondering how much pressure against that was there in Mexico, because as you might know, you're from the Southwest, so you know that there was a fair amount of internal tension over that question of how indigenous people were represented in art.
I think a lot of that is going to come out as I explore more about Ramirez and some of the other people within the ministry. I expect some of that to come out, but also I think the issue that you're raising is the critical issue that I wanted to come back to, that I think raises what's a pretty interesting story for Mexico into a more international situation. And my explanation for that is that with the Treaty of Versailles, at the Treaty of Versailles, when they put Europe back together after World War I, who tried to, that is the winners, started defining nations by contiguous geography, and culture became the big definition of what made up a nation. And so this sets off in Latin America during the 20s the great concern of finding out what the culture is and should be. And so there's a fascinating series of efforts by Vasconcelos and in other places to survey, basically to collect folklore, to collect folkloric expressions of what the national culture is. And I think, so the arguments that you are suggesting are not just about these images, but are really, there's much bigger stakes. It's how the nation is going to be defined. And I think, as I said, I think that's the argument that remains in play from 1920 to 1980 in Latin America. Is that the nations are defined in standard cultural terms in one nation, and then that breaks down with the rise of ethnic politics. Yes?
Well, I wanted to know what your interpretation might be of why the emphasis on photographing and depicting indigenous women and not indigenous men.
Well, I think partly it has to do, in my estimation, with when it was being done. And in the middle 20s, there was a migration going on, an urban migration going on, and it was largely male. Men were going to the cities, they were changing out of traditional costumes and putting on working class clothes, bib overalls and things like that, which are not very interesting from a Vasconcelos point of view. And women were maintaining the traje. And by focusing on women's activities and particularly their costumes, it was possible to identify the community, to preserve what that community was like. And I think that's what Vasconcelos had in mind. Certainly it's what Marquez wanted to do.
Without thinking about the exploitation, kind of depoliticizing it, I guess, in a way, by not speaking about why these migrations are happening.
You know, as I said, I think part of this is what is at stake is finding out what the nation has to be to preserve Mexico as a nation. They've got to figure out what the standard culture is and promote it.
Well, you do have, on the other hand, the image of the charro,
Yeah.
which goes very much with the rodeo, the cowboy, a very macho sort of image, and I think it's a companion to, you certainly see plenty of charros in the calendar. So, there you've got, but then underneath it all, one has to take statistically, and here I'm certainly hoping the correct word by Professor Beasley, that everyone in Mexico, except for a very minor percentage, is mestizo. So,
Yeah, I mean,
more or
this
less.
is-
So what kind of, we're getting into class considerations, all kinds of things that come across it, skin color considerations. We're looking at going back to the 18th and or to the castas in terms of racial mingling.
Sure, I mean, if looked at from the government perspective outside of the Ministry of Public Education, to have access to government programs, rural peoples had to define themselves as campesinos beginning in the late 1920s. Being indigenous didn't do you any good politically or economically or socially. It was necessary to be a campesino to have that opportunity. That also is fascinating because there's, you know, certainly there's indigenous institutions in Mexico, but they're not part of the official party like the CNC, the National Campesino Organization, until the 1980s, when suddenly there are changes in the way money is distributed to rural groups, and money starts flowing more to indigenous organizations, so that the ethnic politics at the beginning in the 80s in Mexico is financed by the government itself. It's a fascinating kind of development. Someone, I can't remember whose line it is, who says in the 1980s the face of rural Mexico changed from a campesino to an Indian, which is an interesting change back. Yeah.
We have time for just 2 more questions.
And I think this is where, for example, the question of mestizaje then needs deeper exploration in thinking of how mestizaje was used in one way in the ideology of the government to form a national identity, but how it was being received on the other way by the indigenous peoples themselves, and how oftentimes they used it as a sort of as a politics of survival, right? As a politics of survival, so there is mestizaje by blood, but also there's this whole thing about adopting a cultural mestizaje, in a sense, in order to survive. So which mestizaje are we talking about, right? So that I think leads to demystifying certain things about mestizaje, right? And 2, how the government, for example, how the de-Indianization and the campesinization of the people, right? Turning them into campesinos, came oftentimes through judicial acts against these indigenous peoples. So then, you know, this whole idea of mestizaje, I think it's very obviously very complicated, but need to look deeper into that. I think so.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one place to look at that would be to follow up on Wilkie's book on federal expenditure and social change, and really see how the government is spending money, what kind of organizations receive money. And to me, I think there's a clear pattern that it's campesinos, not indigenous groups, till the 80s, and then all of that changes. Yes.
So is Ramirez to be your biographical subject?
No. You know, I think it would be really interesting, but the Ramirez project, I think, is ideal for a PhD student. Who, you know, I think there's a lot of sitting down and going through a lot of things, and I thought about that, but and I kind of, you know, measured it out. Jukeboxes, mirrors, and so probably the next person who walks in my office and said, I'm not sure what I want to do my dissertation on, bang, they're going to be on their way, and you know, I'll be on my way to the Wurlitzer Sebring Jukebox Archives.
Thank you very much.
You know,